I first got started with computers in high school. I remember my mom one day brought home a Commodore VIC-20 for me because she thought it would be interesting. And I think little did she know what she was setting in motion when she did that. But she brought home a VIC-20, and I outgrew that in about 2 weeks. And then she got me a Commodore 64. And I started playing around with the things that were available to us in the time. This was in the archaic days of the early 1980s, so Ataris and Radio Shacks and Texas Instruments, that sort of stuff. So I didn't start using the Mac until I was in college. I was aware of it. I was actually one of the people who saw the 1984 commercial in the Super Bowl. I didn't know it was coming. It blew us all away. We didn't know what was going on, the awe in the room. But I knew about the Lisa before, obviously before the Mac was out, but before I was aware of the Mac. I'd heard of the Lisa when I was in high school as this wondrous thing, this almost workstation on a hill that was going to have this thing called a graphical user interface, and was going to be the latest and greatest, and it was going to allow you to do all this graphics and design and artwork, and it was something that you were never allowed to touch as a mere mortal, especially as a high school kid. And then they released the Macintosh, and that was the computer for the rest of us, and my journey began. Well, I knew of Apple products from the 70s and early 80s. They were one of the main players around with the Apple II. Some friends of mine had that. I was never really into it. I was a Commodore guy at the time. I think Apple was always more expensive, so we didn't have it in my family. I'd heard about the Lisa when I was in high school. It was one of those castle on a hill kind of computers. Apple is working on this amazing thing that's a cutting edge workstation, and it's going to be fully graphics, and it's going to be for colleges and universities and companies and all that, and it's going to be $10,000, and it was something mere mortals never touched. I'm like, well, that sounds interesting. And then my senior year in high school was 1984. I graduated in 84, and I saw the Super Bowl commercial, the 1984 Super Bowl commercial, and was one of those, oh my God, what the heck is this? No one knew what the hell it was, but that was the Macintosh. The Macintosh was, one of its slogans, the computer for the rest of us. In some ways, a low-cost Lisa. A friend of mine had a Lisa when I went to college. A friend of mine had a Macintosh when I went to college. I started using it with him to do some labs that we had, some physics labs. I enjoyed using the Mac more than I enjoyed the physics class. And that sort of set me down my career in computing and with Apple. So I've been a Mac user pretty much since the platform came out. Not quite in 1984, but by 85, the next year when I was in college. And it was the computer that I used. I had one by 86. I used it in my career. I've worked in audio-video production and media production. The Mac has always been a big system, a big platform in that area. So it's always been what I used. And then Apple started, going on their lean years, and everyone was switching to the PC, and Apple was firing people left and right, and it wasn't sure. You didn't know week to week whether the Mac would survive. And you knew all these things that the Mac had the potential to be. Let me start that again. In the mid-1990s, so you're going to want to do an edit here.
Yeah, let's go.
In the mid-1990s, people weren't sure whether Apple would survive from week to week. I was so angry with the company. I wanted to separate the Macintosh from Apple, from the management. Get the product away from the company because the company didn't know what they were doing. Clearly, they almost went out of business. When Apple bought Next and Steve Jobs came back to the company, it was to modernize the operating system. After 3 different rounds of them trying to develop a new round of the Mac OS to modernize it and bring it into the current world instead of what was really the last remnant of System 7. And next step, which became Mac OS X, was doing all the things that modern operating systems are supposed to do. It had protective memory, it had preemptive multitasking, it had, it had protective memory, it had multitasking, it had all the things you would want for a modern operating system that the Macintosh had never had, and Apple had been trying to bring it to the Mac. And in 2000, I was playing around with a beta version of what was then going to be called Mac OS X. And I thought, I'm curious how much of the original Mac is still in what I'm looking at today. And this was, again, 2000, old Macs were going for a song. No one was collecting them. I was able to pick them up for free or for $5 each. So I picked up an old Mac, and I downloaded the original Mac system software. In those days, Apple let you do that. They weren't being hard asses about it where you couldn't download anything. So I got copies of all the system software. And at one end of my desk, I had a Mac, I think it was a 512K, but the original design, running System 1. And on the other side of my desk, I had my modern Mac, I think it was a 9600, with a beta version of Mac OS X. And it was 20 years, almost 20 years separated into two. Here's the beginning of the Macintosh era. here's the current state of the Macintosh era. And I thought, how cool is this? To have this in one table, this whole range of possibilities. And a lot of it, you looked at the modern Mac and it was very recognizable as what came in 1984. Certainly was a lot more complex, but the essence of it was still there. That, for better or for worse, led down the path of my now having hundreds of Macintoshes, learning more about the history of the company and the history of computers than I ever expected possible. So as I've started collecting more, most collectors begin to understand that their collection size is really only limited by the amount of space that they have. There's a fine line between hoarding and collecting. I think everyone can agree with that for those of us who are collectors. I've limited things to Macintosh because that's what I've used as my personal system, and there's a lot of other people who collect other types of computers. You don't need to do everything. However, the Macintosh didn't come out of nowhere. The Macintosh came out of an effort to develop a computer with what was then a groundbreaking thing called a graphical user interface, desktop office metaphor, menus, windows, icons, the mouse, all of that. The Mac was not Apple's first product to do this. Apple's first product to do this was the Lisa. And the Lisa, of course, was developed based on the work done by Xerox PARC with the Alto and the Star computers, where they first came up with this type of operating system and how it worked. And Apple then, sort of took over the research. They licensed the technology from Xerox. Several Xerox engineers came to Apple, and they started working on, the first real commercially available system that used this technology. The Lisa was far ahead of its day. They knew that at the time. It was very expensive. Part of the reason it was expensive was they were pushing the cutting edge of what it was supposed to do. But it was really a very groundbreaking computer. The Lisa was the first thing that the general public saw of what became the general paradigm for computing. The graphical user interface, having an office metaphor, having menus available, not having to type commands in on the command line. The Lisa failed for a number of reasons. Some of which will be discussed by other experts here in this very documentary. But it was very groundbreaking. A lot of what happened subsequent to that wouldn't have existed if the Lisa didn't exist. Now, I always knew about the Lisa. Again, when I was in high school, I'd heard about this thing. It was the computer on the hill. It was, this amazing advanced computer that I could never touch. And then by the time I started using computers, the Lisa was long gone. It was out of production. It had been discontinued. Some unknown quantity of them were buried in a landfill in Utah, and people were selling them. They were repurposed as Macs and things like that. So I kind of always wanted one just to know what it was like and to play with it. I'd had the desire to get one, add one to my collection for that reason. I got my Lisas from Jason Scott, who is now at the Internet Archive and has been involved with classic vintage computing for a long time. I had an open house at my Vintage Mac Museum here in Boston after I moved into this house, and Jason came by. He had lived in the Boston area at this time. Looked around, knew what I had, said, "I noticed you don't have any Lisas." I said, "You're right, that's on my list." He said, "I have two, would you like some?" Well, of course I did. They weren't working. I didn't think that was a big deal at the time. It's not easy to restore vintage computers. It wound up taking me 3 to 4 years after I obtained them to finally have a working one. But even though I specialize in Macs, this is really this is the first Mac, if you will. This is the first system of this vintage, of this lineage. The Lisa operating system is not the Mac operating system. It doesn't work one-to-one. It takes a little getting used to. But it's the essence of that design. And the Lisa had things in 1983 that the Mac didn't get until after the year 2001. So as a Mac collector, if you really want to know where the Mac came from, it's impossible not to include the Lisa in your thinking. In my work as a Mac consultant, I would say the Lisa is non-existent. It's something that's of interest to vintage computing folks. I have never run into one. I've run into some pretty old computers, which surprised me, but I've actually never run into a Lisa in the field. In fact, it's something that I use as a little quiz for my clients when they come to my office and I say to them, "Do you know what this is?" Most people kind of visually recognize it, but not everybody knows what it is. I have had some people bringing old Macs in, which I really encourage them to upgrade to something newer. One of the reasons, besides the fact that it's a 30-year-old computer, the Lisa didn't have any third-party software. The Lisa had a complete Office suite that Apple provided, and that was pretty much it. And it never really obtained a market share that would allow it to have third-party software or be useful in something in a business sense that people would use it outside of a college or university. So I don't think, if I found someone using a Lisa, I would probably write a whole article on it because it would be that interesting that they even had. Why do you have one? What are you doing with it? So people have asked me, where does the Lisa fit in the scheme of things? It was a short-lived computer from Apple. It was very expensive. In terms of a business venture, it was a flop. It didn't do well for the company. They discontinued it. They had to bury them in a landfill. Steve Jobs got so fed up with the Lisa team that's why he left and took over the Macintosh project, because he hated them and they hated him, and then he actually tried to sabotage things. That's Apple's soap opera story. There's a lot more of that you can read about ad infinitum if you like. Why is this computer that only existed for a couple of years so significant when the computer that succeeded it, what I like to say for people about the Mac, which is also a controversial computer, the Mac is the longest running model and brand of computer around. No other single computer brand has lasted for 30 years. So certainly it has a much greater presence. But it wouldn't exist without the Lisa. Where does the Lisa fit in? Modern computing really started with two places or two events. One was Douglas Engelbart in a presentation, I believe it was for SRI, Stanford Research Institute, that has since been termed the mother of all demos. And Doug Engelbart demonstrated things like a mouse and networking, and I don't know if they were doing video transmission at the time, but a lot of the different aspects that would become the heart of computing over the next 40 years at this point. About a half decade after that, Xerox was looking for a way to broaden out of just the copier industry. They were selling paper, they were selling toner, they wanted to go for the electronic office. Side note, they should have stuck with the electronic office because they could have marketed what would have been their future instead of allowing it to threaten their business. But I digress, that's a study for business schools. Xerox really implemented a lot of what Doug Engelbart envisioned. They came up with a way to make an operating system that was a graphical user interface, that had object-oriented aspects of it and programming, that had menus, that had windows, that had the desktop metaphor. They also came up with the idea of networking. They implemented Ethernet, they implemented the mouse, they implemented the laser printer. They were doing a hell of a lot of work there back at Xerox PARC in the day. This was first put into being, if you will, into practice with a computer called the Alto. The Alto was never sold to the public, but it was really the first computer that incorporated all these elements and that you could say was the first non-command line modern computing system. The Alto was supplemented a few years later with the Xerox Star, which was a more advanced version of the same thing, and was available for sale. I don't know that you would have known it, but it was available for sale. It was not cheap. It was available to corporate customers, available to industry. It's a proof of concept from a research lab, and the wider world isn't often aware of those things. Who is aware of those things is other engineers in the industry, in particular several engineers at Apple, who eventually convinced Steve Jobs to come over to Xerox and see what they were doing. Steve Jobs is many things, but he also recognizes a good idea when he sees one. And he really, in less than half an hour, if what I read is correct, understood where this was going, knew that the graphical interface and the office metaphors where the future was going to be, and this is what he wanted Apple to do, and this is where they were going to take their new workstation computer they started developing, which was ultimately called the Lisa. The Lisa was the first computer that shipped to the world in any significant quantity and was marketed to the general public. It wasn't just a lab system. It wound up being purchased by universities and large corporations, mainly because those are the people who could afford $10,000 computers at the time. But it wasn't only for them. Anyone could buy a Lisa. Kevin Costner had one in a TV commercial back in the day. He didn't use the mouse right, but he did have one in a TV commercial. And the Lisa was known. I mean, Apple is an innovative company. They're also an innovative marketer, and Apple gets their message across. And when I was in high school, I'd heard about this thing called the Lisa. There were articles on it. There were ads for it. You knew it was out there. You just couldn't necessarily touch it. Then when the Mac came out, again, it was the computer for the rest of us. Now you could touch it. Now you can play with it. Now you could see what this was about. So the Lisa's significance was in taking what was really a lab technology and bringing it available to the general public and making the public aware of it. By itself, it was not a successful product, nor was it technically the first product sold to the public with a graphical user interface. But, how many people actually invented the telephone before Alexander Graham Bell? It comes down to what's the most effective and what's the most long-standing impact. And for that reason, as time goes by, the Lisa has gained incredible significance, and more people are trying to realize what were these people doing, what was it about, and why was this happening in the early 1980s. So where does the Macintosh XL fit into the scheme of things? The Macintosh XL is a variant on the Lisa 2, which is the second version of the Lisa that was produced. The first Lisa did not have an internal hard drive. It had two 5¼ inch floppy drives, was fairly unreliable, was out for I think less than a year, and then Apple came out with the second version, upgraded it to an internal hard drive and a 3½ inch floppy disk. So most Lisas that were sold and available are actually Lisa 2 systems, which is what you see behind me here. What Apple decided to do was repurpose the Lisa as a variant of the Macintosh called the Macintosh XL, XL for extra large. And then they released a version of the Mac system software called MacWorks, which allowed you to run Mac OS on the Lisa hardware. Now you had essentially a Mac Plus 68,000 machine with 1 meg of RAM, an internal hard drive, which the Mac didn't have, the nice bigger screen, the nice big keyboard, and it ran Mac software. So it was essentially a high-end Mac Plus. Apple sold this as the Macintosh XL. They sold it themselves for a while directly. Then they sold the remaining inventory to a company called Sun Remarketing, which sold them off for a few more years until there was finally no demand for it, and the remaining product was shelved, buried, or sold off to private industry, whoever wanted to pick it up. At the point where they abandoned the Mac XL, they were coming out with the Mac SE and the Macintosh 2. So there really was no need for that product anymore. They had an expandable system. They had larger screens, separate monitors with the Mac 2. They had more powerful systems with the Mac SE. And the whole reason for the XL was to sell off extra inventory. Apple didn't want the prices of Lisas and Mac XLs to get so low because the market was saturated that there was no demand and no value in them. So they discontinued it entirely and buried the remaining stock in a landfill in Utah, which frankly is a journey worth taking to find. Now, someday I've thought about this, because I'm sure other people have. But the XL really wasn't a Lisa. It was a Mac in a Lisa's body, and it was a product that was designed just to get rid of inventory. So I think they didn't need it. They didn't want to deplete the value anymore. It would have been more interesting if they'd brought back the Lisa and developed the Lisa OS as an alternative to the Mac OS, which even at that era was starting to fall behind what Microsoft was starting to do, even with DOS and early Windows back then. But that wasn't Apple's direction, and it took 20 more years for the Mac to then catch up with what the Lisa had back in 1983. All right, so I'm sitting here in front of two of the pieces of equipment in my collection, my Lisa 2 and an original 128K Macintosh. Both of these systems were for sale in 1984. One looks a little more sophisticated than the other one. One also cost 4 times as much as the other one, so that's not entirely unexpected. Lisa again introduced the graphical user interface to computing. So this was the desktop, having an office metaphor. You have files, you have folders, you have a trash can to put things away, you have a calculator, etc. You had a mouse with a pointer to select things on screen, and you had menus which gave you the choices of what you could do with the operating system or the document you were working with. The Macintosh now has a similar thing. You have a smaller screen in this case, but same idea, black and white graphical user interface. Mouse works exactly the same way. Menus to choose what you can do with documents. There was no hard drive in the first Macintosh. There was no hard drive in Macintoshes at all until about 4 or 5 years after the product came out. The Macintosh shipped with 1 floppy disk. If you had enough money, you had 2 floppies, and you could save your data on one drive without putting it in the other one. If not, you swapped floppies a lot. The Lisa 1 had an external hard drive that sat on top. The Lisa 2 has the hard drive inside, or you can get the drive that sat on top. So it had a hard drive back in 1983 when hard drives were the size of things that typically went in the cargo sections of airplanes. So much easier to save your work and not have to swap things. The Lisa is interesting in that it uses a metaphor called a document-centric model. Apple played around with this in the Macintosh in the mid-1990s with something called OpenDoc, for those of you who are real geeks and remember this thing. With a document-centric model, you're working on the document as your main item, and different programs can use it depending on what you need to do. If you need to use a graphic part of it, you need to use a word processing part of it, etc. The Macintosh has a program-centric model. You run a program and it opens a file, and you do things on that file, and then you save that file. You're running a program and you create files with the program. With the Lisa, you're working on a document and the program works in the background. It's a little hard to explain, but you can look at it. Let me take this program here, Lisa Draw. The Lisa also shipped with a complete Office suite. So it came with Lisa Office, which had a draw program, paint program, word processor, spreadsheet, terminal, project management, all of that stuff. So the Lisa uses a document-centric model, whereas the Macintosh uses a program-centric model. On the Lisa, you open you tear off a sheet of paper from a pad of that type of document and you work on it. And the program automatically knows to work on that file. So you tear off a piece of paper from word processing. If I open my Lisa drive here, double click on it, I go to Lisa Write. Now I don't have I have an application for Lisa Write, but that's not actually what I want to do to start the program. I have a stack of paper here called Lisa Write Paper. And I want to click on the stack of paper and it will create a new piece of paper for me and then open Lisa Write to work on it. Here's my new piece of paper, working at blazing speeds. This was very fast in 1984. Now I'm opening my paper, Lisa Write Paper, with the date on it. Notice it has a name and date. I don't have to assign that. It saves automatically. We lost that for a while, then it came back. The Lisa was ahead of its time. Just a moment, please. It's getting ready. Here's our wait cursor. Nice big hourglass. Okay, I can type my manuscript. Oops, make typing mistakes. M-A-N-U-S-C-R-I-P-T. Okay, assume that's my best-selling novel. I don't need to save this. I just actually double-click to close the box. Paper is automatically saved. Again, you're dealing with 1980s time frames here, not 2000s time frames. And there's my Lisa paper, torn off the pad of Lisa paper. Now let's see how we do this on the Macintosh. So the Mac uses a program-centric model, which is what most things use and you're familiar with today. The Macintosh, you start with launching the software you want, not creating a document for it. Open my disk. I'm going to double-click on Mac Write. Those of you who are familiar with early Apple stuff may notice that the opening graphics and animations are a little different. This is Macintosh System 1. Now with all of this stuff, what's interesting is this is recognizable as a word processor today. Most of what's in the computing from the 1980s, not much has changed today. We've paid Microsoft for it many times, but not much has changed. Here is my document. I can type my wonderful manuscript with my caps lock on and all the typos. I actually have to save this or it will be lost. It will prompt me if I try to close it without saving it, but I still have to tell it that, as opposed to it actually saving it. I then have to give it a name and go ahead and save the document. Not a big deal, obviously, but it's a different model than the Lisa uses. Both are graphical user interface systems, but they have different philosophies as to how they work. So one question, which you'd ask is, why would people deliberately cripple a product? I mean, if Apple had already done research like this, why would they make something that is less capable? There's sort of two answers to that. One is cost, in the sense that this product costs 4 times as much as that. You can't build as much into it. But that was really secondary because this is just the first in a line of products. With the Macintosh, Apple wanted to make something that was simple for everyone to use. With the Lisa, Apple wanted to push the edge of what was going on in technology at the time. A lot of the arguments that Steve Jobs had with the team was the Lisa too complex? Was it going in the direction that users would understand versus is it going in something that the average person can understand? Probably the thing which most people see as the best result of those decisions is the single button mouse. Apple came out with a single button mouse because it was less confusing to people than having a multi-button mouse, which most workstations would have at the time. The simplicity in the Macintosh was designed so that you didn't need to read a big manual. Anyone could walk up to it and understand, maybe with a few minutes of training, how to use it. Whereas with something like this, or most computers, frankly, you did need some instruction time to understand how to use it. That was a blessing and a curse. The Mac is no longer the simple machine it used to be, and it's also a lot more confusing to learn. But this was a deliberate design decision. It wasn't to cripple one in favor of the other. So I think one difference in thinking about the Lisa versus the Mac in its day, not today, but were the target markets for each system. The Lisa was designed as a business system. or as a workstation and a research utility, but essentially as a business system. It came with a suite of applications, an Office suite of applications, a word processor, a spreadsheet, project management. Project management didn't come to the Mac for several years. Labeling program, graphing program. This was designed to get work done. Networking was a big part of it. You can network your leases together. You can print to networked printers. It was always designed as a collaborative system. It was always designed to get work done in groups or teams, even if you weren't sharing the documents the way we do today. With the Macintosh, it's really a single user system. It's empowering the individual. Mac Paint, Mac Write, Mac Draw, all of these things. What can you do as an individual that you couldn't do before? The Macintosh, in terms of being a business machine and a workstation, took many years to get there. The Mac Plus and its variant, the Macintosh XL, was really the first machine that had the capabilities to allow it to be, frankly, pretty useful, other than just a nice expensive toy. It came with 1 megabyte of memory, which the Lisa had from the beginning, as opposed to 128 or 512K. It had expansion capability for external hard drives and monitors. It had the laser writer, came out at the same time. Microsoft was shipping their versions of the Office applications, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. At that point, the Mac could really be something that you can use in business. This was 4 years after the product came out, whereas the Lisa had this from day one. So the Lisa exhibited many things, which is perhaps true of Apple's philosophy to this day. We will take care of things for you, don't worry about it. And that included to shutting down the machine. There is no shutdown command on the Lisa. When you first play with the Lisa, you're looking at the thing going, how do I turn it off? I mean, yeah, I could pull the power plug on it, but how do I turn it off? This is ridiculous. How do I put things away? Well, it's kind of close to pulling the power plug. The power button is intelligent. If I press the power button here, it won't just shut off. The Lisa will put everything away for me. It will save documents. It will close documents. It will make sure everything's written correctly. And then it will very nice and cooperatively, come on, wake up. The Lisa is turning off. You're going to have to edit out some in the middle of this.
I know.
Fades out nicely. And it's off. With the little pulse on the screen, you have to have that.
I always love that. Always scared me a little bit because you're like, oh crap.
The Macintosh actually, in later versions of the system, it did actually have a shutdown command. In System 1, it did not have a shutdown command, so that gets a little confusing too. You would just eject the disk. And switch the computer off. Starting with System 2, there was a shutdown command, and it would eject the disk and put a little message on screen saying it is now safe to turn the computer off.